So we've had some really fantastic speakers throughout the day, and we're really fortunate to close out the day to have some reflections from another fantastic speaker who we actually were fortunate to hear from earlier in the day, Robert Fabricant. Some of you may have been in our Designing for Impact session a little bit earlier on and heard him speak, but for those who are not, Robert is the principal and co-founder of Dahlberg Design. He leads the global team there with studios rather in Dakar, London, Mumbai, Nairobi, and New York City. He applies human-centered design to address societal challenges and much, much more. And we are truly fortunate and blessed to have him close out the session today. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be part of this day and to see design take hold at Duke at the School of Business. I've had the last couple of weeks a chance to talk to some business students at Columbia and their design and innovation club, as well as Yale. So it's been great to kind of hear people's questions and reflections on how they see design fitting into their work.
Yeah, and it's something that we're really proud of, both from a club perspective, we even get into our programming throughout the year, but also from just a broader school and academic perspective, we're starting to weave it into our curriculum with some new courses. So we're really excited to continue to impress it on students as they go through their Fuqua journey. So before we jump into the questions that we have for you, I was hoping that maybe, perhaps for the folks that weren't able to join our previous session, if you could just share a little bit more about your background and sort of your path into design. I remember hearing from you that you sort of come from a family of makers and designers.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate growing up. I'm obviously a little longer in the tooth than most of you folks. Growing up in New York, I was exposed to the idea that there were a diversity and a plurality of creative outlets, professional outlets as a kid. I was always a kid who drew and doodled, and just, making things and doing that was always part of kind of how I just engaged with the world and found inspiration, particularly in a place like New York. And yeah, my sister is a book designer. My mother is a food writer and a cook. And so, I always knew some form of making would be part of what I would do, but the journey's been long and somewhat torturous. So having been exposed to design, probably, even though I was in a place with a lot of creative outlets, I still came away from my early exposure working in kind of corporate graphic design, which was kind of one of the dominant kind of design fields in New York at the time, a bit uninspired and disconnected from the issues and ideas that I kind of wanted to work on and engage with. And the way that designers engaged with people in that graphic design world just seemed a little removed. It seemed like it was all coming down to very kind of specialized skills and very kind of rarefied outputs. And I could sit in a room with people. I worked on this big project for the New York City Health and Hospital Corporation, and people were in a room talking about health and its role in society and the need to shift people's perspective and relationship to the healthcare system, but it was resolving itself in a corporate identity, which didn't seem like the most satisfying way to apply that creative thinking. So I took a lot of twists and turns. My first job after college was in community organizing in the criminal justice system in New York. And I think what got me there was kind of that thread of being able to organize. So I organized groups of volunteers throughout New York State to spend time in the New York State court system. At that time, it was the war on drugs, and there was a sense that the court system was being overwhelmed. And while there was a lot of advocacy for cops and for prisons, there wasn't an advocacy for courts, the resources courts need. And so I organized volunteers to go into courts and just observe what was going on. And it taught me a lot of things. First, it taught me a lot about feedback and the missing feedback kind of in the world, and in a lot of the systems we engage with, even the most important ones. We have access to free and open court proceedings, but no one really pays any attention to actually what happens. And so I organized these groups of volunteers, mostly senior citizens, and they would go upstate into small town and community courts. And they would just keep an eye on what was happening. Were things running late? Was the judge respectful? I mean, not big things. They weren't legal experts. And we would publish reports. But what was so interesting is then I'd go with my boss up to Albany to lobby for reform, deep reform in the court system. You guys may or may not know this, but most judicial appointees in New York State are really just appointed by the Democratic party mechanism. And so it's often given out as like a political reward. They're not necessarily fine jurists. So we were going to lobby on that. And it was interesting because we'd sit in the room with these state senators and assemblymen, and we were just creating trouble. Like they had these judgeships to give out to their political allies, and why would anyone kind of cause trouble? But what was so interesting is that we could bring feedback to them about what was going on in their community. And I'm not saying it was the most rigorously collected, but it was the only feedback. It was the only voice of the community. And it gave us a story, and it gave us leverage to say, from the grassroots level all the way up to the senior level of policy, like there are needs that we can trace and problems that connect together at a big scale and a very localized scale. So that's where I started. And it was that kind of connective tissue that to me was so inspiring about that work, even though it was hard. And so it took me a while to figure out, well, how do I bring that back into the world of design? And so after some other turns, I started working back in technology. I got excited about kind of the rise of the web in the mid-90s. I worked out at Microsoft, and I was working in virtual environments with them, kind of looking at social structures that emerged at small and big scales. This was pre-Second Life and all that. And so it's just, some of these threads just started coming together around the way systems behave, how individual needs shape the way those systems work, and how much feedback is missing, and how much you can use it to rethink the systems around us, and how little that's being done. And so that started out, at Frog, working with big companies like GE and Nike and others, AT&T, and then eventually led to the work we're doing now, where we started to realize the systems themselves had a whole lot of stakeholders beyond business leaders, and a whole lot of other layers and dialogue and conversations and feedback was missing between policymakers and other folks. And so embedding a design practice at a place like Dahlberg allows us to get into the room at least and try and figure out how we can use design to shape those discussions and conversations to bring that feedback to the table.
Yeah, it's such an incredible story. And I think what you're pointing at is this notion of listening kind of being a lost art, of listening and then translating being a lost art. And it's really cool to see how you've pulled those threads of being better able to listen, and then being better able to use what you hear to design better processes, whether it's in something as important as criminal justice or something as important as the sort of technologies we'll take forward in the future. So that's a really incredible story. And I know you use the word torturous, but I think it almost sounds like a serendipitous series of experiences that led you to where you are today. I'd be really curious to hear about, one of the great gifts that I think you have working at Dahlberg is that you have the ability to work with everyone. And it seems as if you have been able to work with everyone. I remember in my previous career at USAID, we had the chance to work with you all, but I know that your list of clients goes far beyond just the government sector, as you've just sort of alluded to. So given your experience with working with government, the private sector, NGOs, a little bit of everybody, could you just share with us what it's like to work with a few of the different archetypes of clients that you've worked with, and maybe articulate some of the differences between the types of clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what I think is so interesting about the skills our team is developing is that there are such a plurality of stakeholders that we need to take into account in every project we do. And again, coming back to, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but coming back to that example of early in my career, the challenge is to maintain that thread between stakeholders that exist at community level and large scale clients. And there's no question that if the lead partner is a government versus a big business like, Safaricom or GSK or a big bank, like the mindset is going to be quite different. And in a way, what's interesting at this moment of time is that the private sector, a lot of the organizations we work with, and this wasn't always true, but it's true now, talking to them about design, talking about user-centered methodologies, particularly leaning a little bit more heavily on kind of the benefits of like an agile approach and kind of the little bit the halo effect from Silicon Valley and startup culture, entrepreneurial culture. Like that's all something they swim in and talk about. But at the same time, as companies and as decision-making structures, they have a hard time breaking down the silos to really embrace that way of working. So in some ways it's easier, in some ways it's harder. You know, you don't have to introduce the language, you don't have to explain the idea of prototyping, but the difference between what they might be doing today, which is, you know, much more driven, let's say, by marketing and less by design and user-centered kind of prototyping approaches, can be a little lost on them. When you go to talk to governments or foundations, you know, on one level, it may be a little bit of a bigger jump. But on the other hand, there's often more open-mindedness. And I think it comes down to one way to look at it is, you know, differing concepts of who they're serving, you know, and businesses will look at customers. And so in the panel we had previously, there was a question from the audience around, you know, how can design shift power dynamics and shift cultural norms? And part of that is often helping some of the partners we work with in the corporate sector, customers and clients, see value in groups they didn't see before, you know? So how can women entrepreneurs, for example, or youth, you know, be much more valuable part of their business than they might think? So they have a customer lens. And then when you look at governments, it's sometimes a little bit harder to know what that lens is. On the one hand, it's citizens, they're there to serve a population, but it's a little harder to figure out, well, what does that really mean to them? You know, and so it's interesting. We did some work with the Ethiopian government. And on the one hand, you know, it didn't seem obvious to us when we kicked off the work that the contribution my design team was going to make, was going to provide to the project, which was kind of qualitative research into prototyping and some digital design on our web portal, which I'll explain in a minute. It just didn't seem clear to us that it was going to land with the government, you know? And the firm was doing a whole bunch of other things to look at kind of youth employment and ease of doing business in Ethiopia. And instead, you know, the switch really flipped, and it flipped for two reasons. The first was they happened to have a pretty big gap in the data and the understanding outside of some big city centers of what was going on in terms of the sort of journey that people were on towards formal employment. And so even the qualitative research we did and the journey mapping we did opened up a space for policymakers that was kind of closed to them. They knew politically that they had to offer solutions that had a broad breadth and were equitable across the country, but they didn't have anything to really base it on, and we were giving them something. And second is, once we brought those journeys in and we got policymakers around the table, they were very interested in collaborating around trying to understand and break down what we were learning. And we could follow up with some quantitative surveys and other ways that kind of gave them a little more of a broad base of data. But it was interesting to see that process take hold with a client like that, and recognize that going in, we didn't know exactly what user needs or what type of user was going to create new value and open up the space of possibilities for how they might look at a problem. But once we found that, it was because they're governments and they have strong bias towards serving these communities, it turned into a very, very strong collaboration. So that's just one example, and like I said, it's just a little less obvious, which I really enjoy. It can be a bit of a headache, you know, but a little less obvious where that lever is going to be. And with the private sector, usually it's a little more obvious. That doesn't mean it's easier.
Yeah, and I think that's as you said at the very beginning, that's a skill that you all are developing, and I think one of the key pieces of value that you probably bring as well is sort of articulating the importance of making those connections and pulling on those different levers to different types of clients. So I think that's an incredible value that you all bring as a firm as well. I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, you know, digging a little bit more into the work that you've done. And I know it's difficult to sort of pinpoint a specific favorite project, as it may be akin to sort of choosing a favorite child, but looking at all of the broad swath of industries and clients and projects that you worked on in your past, is there one that sort of rises to your top top five as one of your favorites, whether it's because of an incredible insight that was developed from it, or a really sort of at first hesitant client who became an absolute proponent afterwards? Is there something that rises to the top as a favorite?
Really not. I mean, I can talk about a couple of things I'm excited about right now.
Sure.
We're doing a lot of work looking at the experience of platform workers around the world. So as you know, it's a phenomenon that has huge implications in markets as diverse as Indonesia, India, Colombia, in terms of, how it's shifting the dynamics, both in negative ways in terms of kind of level of risk and exposure that workers face in these platform environments, but potentially in positive ways in harnessing workforces that can speak and act in different ways in terms of the kind of collective action you're seeing out there. So really looking at the economics of it with one of our favorite clients that's very focused on financial health and seeing the commonalities and differences across markets is just really exciting. And I think, is a really great example where there's an emerging shift in people's lives and behavior and the existing assumptions we make about how how markets work, labor markets and other things are changing rapidly. But the story is different from a taxi cab driver, an Uber driver in Mumbai, to someone who's preparing meals, to someone who's trying to rent out their apartment. It's just all different. So it's one example of something we're really excited about to see what comes out of it. We're in mid-stride, and we're using a really rich mix of remote research tools to try and get at it. In addition to some of the kind of qualitative and participatory sessions we're doing, we're using digital tools to do some more longitudinal research with people and look at how to map their, their financial lives, some quantitative surveys, a whole interesting mix. So that's one example of something that I'm very excited about, and I think could have some far-reaching kind of insights that, again, are a little bit ahead of the sort of more established ways of collecting data on workforces like that.
Yeah, I know the list of tools and approaches that you have as a firm is just innumerable, and it often seems as if you have the perfect tool for the perfect situation. I'm curious if you could sort of give us a peek behind the curtain and walk us through how you as a firm approach the process of figuring out what out of your list of tools makes the most sense for a particular project that you are working on. How do you sort of go through your resources and figure out, who's the right person to deploy here? What's the right process that they should follow for the maximum impact for your particular client?
It's a great question. And honestly, one of the pleasures of starting a design practice inside a place like Dahlberg is you're sitting side by side with people who are shaping a lot of strategies and, establishing kind of the priorities and metrics that are going to guide, an effort. And so that's one realization. And so sitting side by side together is great because we can come up with a common kind of learning agenda. I think the other thing that's nice sitting side by side is that the reality is that most of the problems we work on and most of the challenges we're trying to address, there are huge gaps and huge assumptions being made by all the stakeholders. And so, often that's the pivotal piece, where are the gaps in knowledge? What are the assumptions being made? And coming back to, a word that I think is closely related to design, which is possibilities. One of the things that we feel a lot when working with folks with particularly from more of a business and management consulting background, is a lot of that is kind of based on best practices. Here's what exists today. How do you optimize for it? And a lot of what design is trying to do is say, well, what if we could change the possibilities? What if we could fundamentally create something in the market that changes those dynamics? What could that be? And so we're looking at assumptions both from the negative perspective, the risk perspective, what are we risking missing based on the assumptions we have and the data we have, but also where is the possibility space that we might want to learn more about. And so usually that kind of sets the agenda for how we're going to explore from there in terms of the right research and analysis, I think the main thing that we're always trying to do, like on the one hand, you're right, the firm has a variety of skills and capabilities from data analytics to business analysis and financial modeling to the qualitative research we do and quantitative, all that stuff, behavioral science, whatever. But I think the main thing we're trying to do is, regardless of which skills are being brought to the table, how can we proceed in a more iterative way? And how can we bring more of a sense and more opportunities to prototype and test as we go? I think the thing that makes my team most uncomfortable is when someone's sitting down at a project and thinking, okay, I'm going to work backwards from the logical model I built. I'm going to spend the next 6 weeks building it out and fine tuning it. And only then are we going to start to do something to see if it actually works. That makes us uncomfortable. And on the flip side, if we're with our research peers are like, let's do a lot of research. Let's come out with a study. And then let's figure out what could be done. And I think, the design mindset, even though our work is very research driven, is to sort of test and iterate on that set of possibilities much more quickly. And, we need some trust to do that. And that's part of the journey we're on within both the firm and the clients we work with is, getting some buy-in for that trust, figuring out which parts of it are the right parts to prototype and test, and where do we have some more established answers that we don't have to lean into as much. So in an ideal world, the core consulting team can analyze spaces that we feel pretty confident about, and we can focus a little more on emerging spaces where the data is not going to lead us to an answer in a way that we could feel confident about, particularly when we're advising governments or foundations or others. I don't know if that's too theoretical an example, a way of talking about it, but that's kind of, for us, part of what makes it fun.
No, I love that. It's perfect. And I think it alludes to, that dream scenario where when you can link up both the sort of qualitative data and, quantitative data analytics with this qualitative narrative that you develop through the iterative design process, you have this beautiful marriage of inputs, and, you have the full complete story that, clients love to hear. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, it seems as if for clients that have worked with design before, they're all in. And even if there's things that you sort of correct along the way, they're excited about the process. But I'm curious to hear how you approach working with a client who's a little bit more unfamiliar with the process and who you may have to give some of this theory to and say, hey, if you hang with us for the next 6 weeks, it's going to be confusing. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but there will be that aha moment and you'll just fall in love with it. How do you approach that conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, not everybody who is exposed to the design process comes away in love with it the way you have finished. So I wish that were the case, and we are a little hamstrung because we kind of feel that our best shot at imprinting on people is when they participate. One of the interesting things happening right now, so, last February and March, we were fortunate as COVID set in because we'd already been doing, given the, even with 6 studios, 2 in Africa, 1 in Asia, we're still often fairly remote to the communities we work in physically. And so we had started bringing remote research methods and trying to figure out other channels we could use to engage research participants. And so when COVID hit, we kind of had to just harvest that. And the reason I bring that up is now, as you would imagine, almost all the research and prototyping we're doing is remote. It brings its own challenges, but it certainly makes participation a lot easier. And so it's been really nice because it's brought that bar down. And it's really interesting to me. I mean, in the past, even with some of your colleagues, it was an effort to get them out of DC, even folks who were well-intentioned, onto the ground and involved. And it was almost at times like, on the one hand, really satisfying when they would join us for on-the-ground research, but it almost felt like we had to pivot and curate that experience a little bit to make sure they got the most out of it. Right now, because everything's being done remotely on Zoom and other channels, our clients can participate and listen in and watch and participate so much more, number one. Number two, the experiences that people are talking about, no matter whether you're doing a global health project or something on financial inclusion, everybody's talking about the same challenges right now in terms of, how they're going to keep their kid engaged, how they're going to, keep their family safe, what's their job security, what financial reserves do they have. So it's kind of helped bring things together in a really nice way. And I would say we have more clients now who are, taking advantage of that. And it's pretty telling to us when even in this environment, clients, stakeholders can't make time for it, because there's really no good reason for that. And I really hope coming out of this that clients will understand that there's a huge opportunity to continue to use these remote channels to stay engaged with and tap into what's going on in people's lives. And I'll give you one more really interesting example. We've done research in a lot of different cultural environments, and it can have a lot of impact on the permission and trust we get to spend time with people, particularly in their homes. And a couple of years back, we worked on a project called the Human Account, where we were building out segments of psychological and behavioral groups within a host of countries around their financial behavior. And one of the countries was Pakistan. And it was incredibly hard to get, and pretty much impossible, to get time alone with women in households in Pakistan for obvious reasons. What's been so interesting is we've been conducting research remotely, and now we're able to do it because we're not physically in the room. It's not triggering the same concerns. And so it opens up a conversation that was harder to have before, which is wonderful. Opens up conversations our clients can participate in. And it usually opens the door for them to feel more personally invested and imprinted with the research and the desire. If you talk to people, your desire to figure out a way to bring changes or ideas or possibilities to them, becomes much stronger. And so, we ran a set of sessions. We partnered with the Lagos Business School to build out a lab for the financial services sector in Nigeria to help them bring more human-centered approaches to their to digital product development. And we ran the lab remotely, but they had a bunch of their executives go out to branches and do some quick, light paper prototyping activities around savings products, other things, really targeting particularly at women. And it was so interesting. A lot of them had spent so little time at the branch level, hadn't engaged branch level employees other to come through and shake some hands. But to sit down with branch level employees and really hear what's going on, and then with their customers, it really left them feeling proud, feeling better connected to why they do the work they do, and a bit more committed. So I'm really hoping that we're going to see some step change.
Yeah, that's an incredibly powerful example, and it just goes to, it speaks to the power when employed. Design thinking can really just entirely change somebody's internal narrative as much as it can show us what the narrative of the situation or experiences as well. So I want to move away from your past experiences and start moving a little bit towards where you see the future of design thinking going. And I'd be particularly curious to hear, we've asked some form of this question throughout the day, but I'd be particularly curious to hear from your perspective, where is the next big application of design thinking? Where have we not applied the tools of design, and where do we need to apply that? We've talked a little bit about our morning keynote speaker spoke about the importance of design for differently abled communities. We've touched on designing around gender equity. Where do we really need this style of thinking in these practitioners?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do believe, I think, as I said on the panel I was on earlier in the day, that we are actually at a inflection point. And the book that I co-authored with Cliff Quang was really tracing the arc of how we got to here. And it was interesting, it looks at, roughly 150 years where we went from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when design was all about creating things that could be better mass produced, to a flip towards focusing on creating things that better suited the end user. And that cycle started, like I said, 150 years ago, fed through World War II and many other stories that we tell in the book, but through Mile Island, et cetera. But, what was interesting is we were working on the book over the 6-year period. We were also starting to see a shift happening. And this is still pre-COVID, but we were starting to see that a lot of where that thinking was reaching kind of escape velocity was with technologies that were so quick to adapt to our needs and preferences that they were creating these kind of positive feedback loops that were taking over our lives. Yeah. and becoming addictive. And so the book kind of, in a funny way, the process of writing it kind of followed that arc. And one of the chapters is on the invention of the Facebook like button, which is arguably an incredible example of user-centered design and at the same time, a very big cautionary tale. And in particular, I think what the book tries to reveal is that the people making these decisions have no more control over their impact and have no better way of predicting their implications than you or I would. It still comes down to people in a room who are, no matter how big a company they sit in, how smart that company is, how much data they have, somebody has to put pixel to paper and create something. So I feel like we're at a point where we're hitting the event horizon on that. And so you asked a great question: what would I look ahead to? Where do I see changes happening? And I'll highlight a couple things. The first is that cycle I just talked about. One of the key inflection points was World War II. And what we captured, and what folks in design have known for a bit, but the story's never kind of been told soup to nuts, is that the government, because of the scale and velocity of the kind of war effort, started asking questions that business wasn't asking. Questions about pilot error, questions about the suitability of technologies and the ability to engineer things beyond people's capacity. And kind of the idea that kind of fell away was this notion that if we just classified people better, we would know which widget in a factory or in a military scheme they could serve better. So it really changed towards the end of World War II, when people were starting to examine what was going on in the way that this kind of massive flow of technology was impacting the war effort. And the reason I bring it up is that washed back into society. So those same designers who were designing controls in, cockpits went on to design the push button dial on your AT&T phone. Yeah. So it washed back into society and set us on a course where so many of the consumer products that drove consumer spending and the recovery and the economic growth after World War II were being fed by a design engine, and a design engine that had largely been created, and design ideas had been created by the government and the military and others. So the reason I bring that up is I think right now we're going to see another cycle like that, which is a lot of the work that we do, working with multiple stakeholders, looking at where people's individual behavior are impacting and changing the way they want to and will engage with companies and business and society, both as citizens and employees, as well as consumers. Like, there's a big change happening there. And I think that the ways of thinking about how you overlay those different conversations and stories together, I think is a place where designers working in the social impact space are going to start to impact what's happening in business. So overall, I see that kind of flow coming back as we look beyond single end users and start to think more collectively. Who makes the decisions about what's in the interest of a community? How is a community involved in the design process? What role do we play? Does government, does a business play in that conversation and in shaping those solutions? And I think that's all changing. And I'll give you one example, coming back to the platform workers, if you want something specific that I would love to see design move into.
Yeah.
And this comes out of some conversations I had with some design leaders over the last couple of weeks around things like org design and org behavior. One of the designers I was talking to, who I greatly admire, was asking the question, why can't I be hired by the employees of a company rather than the management? You get hired by the management thinks you're doing the right thing for the employees and the customers, but the employees and the customers don't actually get to hire you. And so the solutions generally are things that make the management look good, but don't necessarily make these people's lives better, happier, or more meaningful. And he was asking this question, and it led to me to reflect on the idea of overall the changes in the labor market that were happening or accelerated by COVID. And the notion of collective bargaining, which is a very, it's an idea that's been with us for a long time, but it's been largely marginalized in this country, even given a somewhat bad name, as it's somehow anti-capitalist, like workers getting together as anti-capitalist, businesses building scale as capitalist, but workers finding scale as anti-capitalist. Anyway, forgetting that, I do think that there's something about the changing relationship of people to employment and the need to find ways to design for that and find the customer to design for that, that's not the business, that I think is really fascinating. And I think coming back to the platform workers, how can the platforms that have organized workers and to some degree place them back in that, industrial revolution era factory? You're a widget, you're a Uber driver, and you're just one of 10,000 in Mumbai. How can those same things be used to flip the script and flip the dynamic? And the same way that happened 125 years ago, where employee health and wellness, where consumer preference started to drive the way design was applied. I'm hoping that there's something else happening in the area of collective bargaining and collective kind of activism at the worker level, that is enabled by both the platforms we are swimming in today, the changing relationship of remote work, the new power that employees have at places like Google and Facebook. I just think there's something really brewing there. And it's the kind of thing where focusing on individual user needs is not going to get us to that level of value, that level of scale and value. So I'm hoping we can find new clients, and those clients could be, there's no reason why the employees at a place like Google or Facebook couldn't all get together and hire Frog or IDEO to build a platform for them so that they can have a better voice in shaping what Google does. Yeah. There's no reason they couldn't do that. Yeah. And there's no reason that the employees of Uber or somebody else couldn't become your client in that sense. So that's maybe my wish, is to find a way that we can go at the same problems with many of the same skill set, but fundamentally, work for a different client.
Yeah, it's just such an incredible example. And I think there's so much there. And what you're pointing to, this notion of building for employees, building around collective activism, it reminds me just of how useful design is in reminding us that lessons that we see in workforce development could be applied to lessons that we see in community engagement around politics. It could be applied to in all these different fields, and just seeing how the insights that we gain and glean from one industry can be applied to another is just another beautiful outcome of using design, I think. So really appreciate that example. Did also want to call out for the audience, Robert made mention of his book, which was recently published. Our colleagues have dropped it in the chat. It's called User Friendly. It is available on Amazon as well as a number of other platforms. But if you're interested in, as Robert said, not just where design is going, but in the history of design, it's, from my understanding, a series of sort of stories and articles that he and his colleague Cliff Kwong put together, and something we definitely recommend checking out. So Robert, in the last couple of minutes here, I want to move now to sort of your advice for students, recognizing that a lot of us are MBA students or students from other parts of the Duke University system or universities across the country. For students in the audience who maybe are really interested in design but don't have a deep background, maybe they're not a traditionally trained designer or engineer, how do you best recommend that folks in that camp start to think about using design or design tools?
It's a great question. And the bottom line is, I feel every day that the ambitions that we have as a design community to make an impact and improve the dynamics in society in so many areas are so out of scale to the size of the design community. There just aren't that many designers out there. I mean, yes, IBM has built a team of 2,000, Accenture's built a team of 2,000. So there's a scale up going on, but the reality is it's a very small community. And so for me, getting people excited from different disciplines and getting them to understand some of the simple steps they can take to start to bring this way of thinking into their work is critical. One of our fundamental theories of change in terms of being at Dalberg is we're fortunate in that we're swimming in an organization, 500 people, that some of the best and brightest and most capable people in the markets we work in, and the ones who are curious and compassionate. They're young, they're smart, they're creative and curious in ways that might not map exactly to a design skill set, but are equally, if not more impressive. And part of our goal is to imprint some creative tools and approaches on this group of people, not so different than the Duke Fuqua, student body, because we believe in 5-10 years, these folks are going to be launching social enterprises, working in government, leading NGOs. Like, they are on a trajectory of massive influence in the world. And so that's part of our goal. Part of our goal is to get them excited about creative problem solving, about prototyping and user insights, all those things, so that the next time they find themselves as the director of programs in an NGO, like, they're going to be looking for those inputs and looking for those approaches to, model them within the organizations they work in. And so, it is critical that people feel like this is something that they can apply in a practical, common sense way, and not something where, but I will say this from talking to like design and innovation clubs at some of the schools that I know well, and particularly over the last couple of weeks, it's very different to be kind of sitting around a table and reading some design thinking books and kind of doing this in a classroom setting versus face-to-face with people. And with the humility to understand that their lived experience is not yours, their knowledge and awareness and frustration with kind of the conditions and the context and the systems they have to work with is immense. And that's true everywhere. We tend to think of ourselves as well-resourced. Nonetheless, the frustration we feel with interacting with our health benefits and our insurance company are no different than the frustration that someone in Kenya might feel about going into a health clinic. Like, fundamentally, we're all frustrated. And so what I would say in terms of practical advice, is, first of all, don't worry about and don't focus on design thinking and the terminology around it. Find some collaborators, find a community that that has a need or an issue that you feel you can help solve. And just go through the basic steps. You will fail. It's not like the first time you do this is going to work, but just going through the basic steps of walking down, and some of the sort of the book ends with a bit of a piece that I wrote about how you do take these steps. So I would say, if you have time to read the epilogue in the book, it's largely an answer to that question. And it's taking those steps and placing yourself in the shoes, not just to think about what it could be like to design, not to just do the analysis of a problem, but to sit next to someone and try and together kind of tease out how you would prototype a solution, what form that could take, and just walking through those steps, whether it's helping working with an elderly community, to figure out how they can stay in touch with their family and friends, whether it's an experience you just had registering to vote, like anything that you have proximity to, that you can take those steps. The learning and the sense of ownership will both inspire you and intimidate you. And it'll make you look at every other problem you work on, every sort of business challenge you might face if you go work for a company. It'll make you look at it differently. And it'll create some skepticism of the tools that you're learning in business school in terms of, how far that sort of analysis gets you to creating value in the world. It's not that it's not a part of it, but I'd say the sooner you get that skepticism, the sooner you feel that impatience of like, yeah, this all kind of makes sense. The analysis seems good, but I haven't talked to anybody.
Yeah.
And it's so rare. Another thing I mentioned in that section of the book is the few CEOs that I worked with back in my Frog days who had that level of contact with their customers were so inspiring. And it's not like there was a CEO of JetBlue who once a year would sort of fly on a plane and serve as one of the sort of flight attendants, just to live that experience and talk to people. Yeah. And another example is the CEO of Intuit, who spent time bringing a design process into that company and recognizing that tax time, was one of the most delightful experiences for a lot of people because they get a rebate. How do you turn that into a moment of celebration? Like, there are all these little things that CEOs who stayed close to or force themselves to do that really get out of that connection to their customers. And so the earlier you take some time, work on a problem in your community, get that proximity, the more I think as you go and work at a bigger scale, this may not, you don't necessarily want to spend your life perhaps as a community organizer, but the more that's going to inform how you lead and how much integrity you bring to the work you do and the way people respond to it and the sense of possibility you can bring to the problems you work on in the future.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I can't think of a more fitting mission that you've charged us with to end the day. It's essentially, this notion of taking the spirit of creativity, of collaboration, of as you said earlier, just wondering about possibility, and then applying that to whatever field or industry or world or sphere that you're currently living in. And that's certainly something that we will continue to task our peers and our colleagues with as we move forward into the workforce. For me, food and innovation is something I'm really interested in. So I'll have to pick your brain about what your mother wrote about in days gone by. But Robert, just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today, not just for this session today, but for your contributions and insights earlier on. Again, if folks are curious to hear more about Robert's deep experience in the field, highly recommend you check out User-Friendly, look up his work at Dahlberg Design, and just another huge virtual round of applause to Robert for joining us for the day. So Robert, thank you.
Thank you. It's been great to join, and good luck, Vinesh, and everyone on the call.
Thank you.